I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Bruce Chadbourne. Bruce is a retired bivocational Christian minister with a career that began as an officer in the United States Nuclear Navy, followed by anti-submarine engineering and program management. He taught corporate education around the country for various universities and corporations. At the same time, he became licensed in ministry, serving as a Bible instructor, hospice worker, and assistant pastor. Moving to Cornwall Manor 6 years ago, he continues to serve in ministry at Cornwall Manor and at the Lebanon Rescue Mission. Additionally, he volunteers at Cornwall Iron Furnace, giving tours and, of course, performing research. Bruce's interest in history stems from having grown up in central New York in the historic Erie Canal region. In addition to being a student of church history, his own family genealogy originates with the landing of the little ship, the Pied Cow. And you only thought there was a Pied Piper. So there's also a Pied Cow in New England. And his great-grandfather building one of the region's first sawmills in 1634, contributing to the start of the forestry industry in Greater Maine. So please welcome our speaker tonight, Mr. Bruce Chadbourne.
Thank you. And this is coming through, right? Good. I'm going to try one dangerous thing here. How's that? You see a little good. Well, good evening and thank you, Michael. And good evening to everyone here, especially the colleagues at the Iron Furnace Association. And what a wonderful crowd, too. There is a late attendee here. I had this thought this morning that of all these slides and anecdotes about Robert H. Coleman, there's only 2 pictures of him in the presentation. And Sue Hostetter at Mount Gretna responded nicely to my thought, can we have Robert show up? And she did that for us. You saw him being set up. So while I'm talking, don't look at me. Look at the man and think about what was going on in his mind these last number of years. I also want to just welcome Cornwall Manor, my fellow residents. We're celebrating our 75th anniversary this year, as you can see. And actually, over the next couple of months, there will be a variety of historic presentations. This wasn't really intended to be one of them, but it worked out with the iron furnace. Well, why I'm here is that I'm giving a report on the work of John and Margery Feitig, who actually were members of the Friends of the Iron Furnace. And this is work they did over 3 decades. I had the opportunity to, in the last 6 years of being a resident here, to start reading all of the material they accumulated. And they intended to publish their book, as you can see, Memories That Linger, to tell the story of their understanding of Robert H. Coleman and some of the broader Coleman family and the local iron furnace and mine history. So given that they had in mind a book and that we have less than an hour, roughly, it's going to be what we call in the Navy a 30,000-foot flyby, fairly rapid, or maybe you identify with the Cliff Notes version of the story. I do feel I brought in some fresh details that they hadn't thought of, and partly because about when they were working on this several decades ago, they didn't have the benefit of some of the more modern internet tools, if any. Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, and a few others really bring out some interesting things that can augment the story. So, and I am going to read my notes here. I hope you're not too uncomfortable with that, but given the amount of time, I don't want to be diving down interesting little rabbit holes more than I can afford to. So let's begin. I want to say that it's a shame that the Feitigs never published this story. There were several stories published about them and their work in the Sunday edition of the Lebanon Daily News a few decades ago. They were local residents born around 1950. John was a physical therapist at the Veterans Administration here in town, and Margery, a kindergarten teacher in Palmyra. According to the newspaper story, their curiosity in local history started not with, as you might expect, driving by the Cornwall Iron Furnace or seeing the mine, but they would drive down Cornwall Road and noted this little sandstone wall across from Toy Town, and their curiosity was piqued. And they started digging. They pulled the threads, and over a period of time, this research happened. Now, my friends here at Cornwall Manor, Jeannie and Jerry Bolts, I saw Jerry. Jeannie said she might be busy with something tonight. Jeannie worked with Margery, and Jeannie also introduced me to Jane Brewer, who might be here, way in the back. We should make you stand up front. We'll let you off the hook. Jane Brewer's father was Dick Brewer, who was an employee at Bethlehem Steel and a local history buff, and he had taken John under his wing, providing guidance on local history. Jane also, by the way, told me about her grandfather, Samuel Brewer. You might know this story. He was an immigrant from Cornwall, England, and a skip tender at the mine here in Cornwall. Unfortunately, in 1928, he was killed when the skip he was riding up, mine number 3, derailed. Quite an unfortunate story. And for Cornwall Manor folks in the audience, you might be intrigued to know that Sam brought with him from England a man named Norman Matthews, who became a gardener here on the estate, along with Lester Carpenter, who had left us his audio history, oral history regarding the estate here and work that he did over at the furnace. So a question that many of us kind of identify with is, what did you do during the COVID years? And the photo here is meant to give you a sense of my answer. On their passing, the Feitigs left an incredible amount of material. Tried to depict that in the various plastic containers there on the shelf over in the furnace library. This is work they accumulated quite an incredible volume without the benefit of online internet searches, but they left a lot of longhand correspondence, writing to various museums and universities to gather the material that they had. And they invested a lot of their money in paying for copies of things and photographs to accumulate that. And also on the slide, many of you know the Coleman story from a variety of other sources already, and I just tried to enumerate some of them. We could go back to 1900. Henry Grittinger, who was a furnace superintendent, published a number of articles with the Lebanon County Historical Society around 1900. And about that same year, a lady was born, Gladys Fensel. Anybody happen to know this name? You would, yeah, that's Jerry. Okay. She became the registrar at Lebanon Valley College, actually has a conference center named for her over there. And in the Feitig materials was a paper that she published with the Historical Society from 1960. Jack Bittner is a name that's known by many. He contributed in a number of ways, and particularly with history around Mount Gretna. At least that's what I'm familiar with. I've already mentioned Dick Brewer, an accountant for Bethlehem Steel. Many of you might know the book that Richard Noble published, the Coleman story, The Touch of Time, as it was his master's thesis back in 1982. I got a hold of Nick to find out that he's still around. He's up in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's been a radio talk show guy for about the last 17 years and published a few other books. Elaine Ainsworth, with the assistance of Irv Muritz, who's one of our own, published a comprehensive history of the Coleman family in 2018. And Mike already recognized Jim Polchinski over here, whose book, Souls of Iron, published in 2022. And you were just up here back in May talking about the Happy Nine, which dovetails a little bit with some of tonight's material. So. Did I end up? Let me back up just one. I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Yeah. Also, yeah, the last point there, I wanted to acknowledge, certainly there's a number of historians amongst our Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates who deserve to be mentioned there, and they gave me a significant amount of assistance in all the time that I've been working on this. So this is intended to be a bibliography if you're intrigued and want to dig in some of the areas I was. These people can be great sources. And just a little off the top of my head observation here, telling the history of Cornwall, I thought, could be a little bit like the story of Christ. It took 4 gospels from 4 different perspectives to do that. Or perhaps you prefer the other, the old parable of the blind wise men and the elephant. All 4 of them touched a different part of the beast and described a different animal. So sometimes there's other ways of seeing all this information. So what started as a clerical task for me led to a number of unexpected writing projects, and I just listed these here. I've had the opportunity to have these published in LebTown, and Davis Shaver, the editor there, has been very encouraging in publishing the Who Knew series. And then Sue Hostetter, who you saw helping set up the sign here, and Christy Donahue from the Mount Gretna Area Historical Society published the 2 biggest stories, and those are represented by the faces you see, the Anne of Cornwall and then the Robert H. Coleman, Florida Man, which was a lot of fun to write. So with their help and that of our own site administrator, Mike Emery, and also in particular Mike Trump at the furnace, who has this inexhaustible reservoir of photographs, I've been able to create my own version or add my contribution to the stories here. And I want to thank Irv Muritz again. He was instrumental in acquiring these materials from the Feitig's estate. Even a second shipment we got just about a month ago. So what we're trying to accomplish tonight is, as I was digging through all this material, one day Irv asked me whether I had found evidence of a book that the Feitigs were rumored to have been writing. And I said, no, I hadn't seen anything like that. And then one day, in the very last file I'm looking through, and it's always the last place you look, right? I discovered this handwritten outline, a 2-page legal pad. You see the yellow paper, that's the actual outline that they were intending. They were going to call it Memories That Linger, which focused on the 4th generation protagonist of the Coleman family, Robert H. Coleman, H standing for Habersham. And it was going to be written in 18 chapters. The first introduction was called Return to the Mansion Enclosure, which I'll explain a little bit. But that would open the story by setting the stage in Cornwall Center, down here at the bottom of the hill, a site that began with their curiosity of the stone wall that I pointed out to you, and the old stable building that's still lurking back in the trees there, that hopefully more than a few of you have noticed. As I said, this will be a Cliff Notes version of the book. More details are available in those booklets, and I think Sue actually brought some copies if you're interested in purchasing them. One last thing, because there's so many Colemans and Roberts and Anns and so forth, I may at times refer to our guy as Bob, as some of his friends did. So if you understand me, because I'm going to start here in a minute with Robert, meaning the grandfather that started all of this. So chapter 1, let's strap in. We're going to try to fly through here. Story begins in the colonial days, tracing Bob's lineage back to his great-grandparents. The story of great-grandfather Robert H. Coleman has been told numerous times, having emigrated from Castle Finn, Ireland at age 16. But he was not Irish. This English family lived in Ireland on land granted by Charles I. Robert landed in Philadelphia with his brother William, who first went up to Canada and later returned to this region. I don't know that we ever hear about William and what he did. Robert clerked in Philadelphia and Reading, then for Peter Grubb at Hopewell. I don't mean to dazzle you with too many names here. This is the Cliff Notes version after all, right? Peter Grubb at Hopewell before being hired by James Old, and he married the boss's daughter and then began conquering the iron industry in colonial America. Now on the other side of Robert H. Coleman, his family tree were the Habershams. This begins with James Habersham, who was actually Bob's great-great-grandfather, emigrating from Beverly, England. He came over earlier to Christ Episcopal Church in Savannah, Georgia, in the path of John Wesley. Name you might know. Wesley was a missionary and went back to England and had his that strangely warming experience and so forth, and Methodism was born. Following Wesley's footsteps was another famous missionary evangelist, George Whitefield, and he brought Habersham with him. Habersham became president of Whitefield's Bethesda Orphanage, founded in 1740 down in Savannah, and it remains today a private boys' academy, Bethesda Academy. And a little curious anecdote here. When he came over, there was a young fellow named Ben Franklin, who was a friend of Whitefield's, and Franklin was unsuccessful in convincing Whitefield to settle in Philadelphia. So had that happened, just think, funny twist in history. If Habersham and Whitefield had settled here, end of story, and we wouldn't be here, I suspect. So, but by 1744, Habersham became a merchant down in Savannah. He owned a large rice plantation and then began rising in colony politics, eventually serving as lieutenant governor and then acting governor. We'll have to go a little faster, I think. Chapter 2, Great-Grandparents of Fame and Fortune. Now, again, these are the titles that John and Margery had envisioned. Some of the details fleshed out by my study. So in this chapter, imagine a lengthy chapter that incorporates many details and genealogies explaining our Bob's heritage. Robert Coleman has, of course, been described as one of America's first millionaires, and there's a little bit more coming up in chapter 4 here. Now, a few years ago, Jim's presentation, the happy, did I say years or months? A few months ago, the Happy Nine recounted many of the details of the Coleman side of the family. And we've also heard about our iron industry and the competition among members of the Coleman dynasty. What is less known to this audience is the colorful Habersham history. And if we're to understand Bob Coleman, we must dig into this side of the family, which we'll do a little bit tonight. And that's what Feitig did, drawing from a book called, by a guy named Bullock, The History and Genealogy of the Habersham Family, published back in 1901. And just another curious note, incidentally, that before Linda and I moved to Cornwall, we had visited Savannah, not knowing that later we would experience firsthand what Feitig had collected in his research on that story. We got to walk the old streets. Anybody been to Savannah? The old town is very interesting with the parks and all of that. The Habershams enjoyed great wealth with the rice and cotton plantations around Savannah and establishing the cotton export business. There's a little note that he exported the first bale of cotton from the south, from the Savannah port there. They became notorious patriots during the war, capturing British munitions, and afterwards Joseph became Postmaster General under Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. And I would refer to the abbreviated family tree there if you can read it. So what that tells there is you see both sides trickling down to Robert H. Coleman and his sister Anne. The Coleman side on the left, on the right, the great he's a great-great-grandfather. And then what happened is Robert Habersham had 3 wives, and at some point he married his cousin, Mary Butler. I think that's the right name, if I'm reading that right. So that's where Sue Ellen or Susan Ellen Habersham was born, and that's Robert H. Habersham's mother. Okay, chapter 3, Twin Tales of Tragedy, and this will be brief, but no Coleman presentation would be complete without a brief mention of these 2 well-known stories. Many of you in the audience can nod your head now and check. You've heard this before, I suspect. Robert Coleman's oldest daughter, I'm talking about the great-grandfather, the first Coleman. His oldest daughter, Margaret, lived in Philadelphia at Strawberry Mansion, having married Judge Joseph Hemphill. 2 of Robert's younger daughters suffered romantic heartbreak in their lives, and they subsequently fled to Margaret's home, where they died under mysterious circumstances. Okay. Anne, shown in the portrait, was betrothed to James Buchanan. His work seemed more important than their relationship, so consequently, later he became known as our nation's bachelor president. And if you haven't done so, we did that recently. We went down to Wheatland to see his estate, just down in the Lancaster area. Very informative visit. And then Sister Sarah became enamored with Reverend Muhlenberg, to the great disappointment of their father, Robert. And just 3 months after his death, Robert's death, she too died at Strawberry Mansion, as her brothers were, as instructed, took steps to block the relationship. Well, the legacy continues, chapter 4, focusing on 2 key figures, Thomas Bird Coleman on the Coleman side and Robert Habersham on the Habersham side. So if Robert Coleman's 4 main sons, Thomas Bird Coleman ends up with most of the Cornwall properties, acquiring them from his 3 other brothers and expanding operations. John Feitig coined the catchy subtitle here, Master of Forges and Furnaces Ablaze. And Jim's Souls of Iron provides many details on that. I wanted to pause here with an apology to Craig Coleman, who happens to be in the audience. He and I have talked about this before, that the James Coleman side of the family, I think, tends to get underserved here by some of our presentations, and his side of the family is the one that's responsible for the Elizabeth furnace and the North Lebanon furnaces and some significant development of Lebanon. So I make that observation, but then we have to continue along the path that we're on. So maybe sometime in the future we'll get to that. Okay, well, like Thomas in the North, Robert Habersham, namesake of our protagonist, advanced the family cotton business beyond what his parents had done. He was a successful merchant who continued the commercial shipping firm, Habersham and Harris, and as well as their cotton businesses. And despite his losses both during and after the Civil War, he left a considerable fortune at the time of $164,000. The Bullock House shown there is in Savannah, one of their residences. And just as in this area here, Robert Coleman had a number of different estates to his credit. But Sue Ellen grew up there, and our Robert was born there. Robert Habersham died in 1870 while his grandson, our Robert, was at boarding school. We'll get to that in a minute. So, but consider Robert, or Bob, if you will, as a teenager. His father and paternal grandparents had already died as young men. By the way, there's no picture of Robert Habersham to show here, so I found a photo of William Neal Habersham, who was in the family, actually uncle to Bob, and a famous wine merchant. And Bob would later name one of his sons for Neal. The outbreak of the Civil War raises the obvious question of whether the war divided this extended family. Feitig's story is much bigger than Cornwall in our fascination with iron mines and furnaces. perhaps shades of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, cast a little bit of the extent of what could be envisioned here and the dynamics of this big family. The story starts before the war with the marriage of William Coleman and Sue Ellen Habersham in 1855. They came up here and built their cottage in Cornwall, down in the empty field. Empty now because unfortunately the cottage no longer exists. And they would travel north and south on a routine basis. For example, in 1860, the federal census registers them living in Savannah. And I happen to have a letter from the 16th of August in that date, Williams mentioning his northern interests in the Cornwall Railroad and the property in nearby Colebrook. So there's quite an active involvement both north and south. Tensions had been growing for several years, and the family referred to it in their letters that we were able to read. War started, of course, at Fort Sumter in April. Just a month later, William dies intestate at age 34 in Florence, South Carolina. He's buried in Savannah and later reinterred up here in Philadelphia's Laurel Hill Cemetery. In the same month of William's death, Robert Habersham's business in the estate of Sue Ellen Habersham came under garnishment proceedings by the Confederacy to ensure that they had no affiliation with the enemy, which would be us, I guess. But up north here, the iron business and life in general moved on. The federal government, the Bureau of Ordnance, contracted with R.W. Coleman here for 101 tons of charcoal iron for the production of the 50-pound Dahlgren guns to be installed on ships in Philadelphia. And while the war rages on, Widow Coleman, Sue Ellen here, makes renovations to the cottage, I suppose as if life was going on as normal. And the cousins, the Freeman cousins, were vacationing in Newport. But from the south, some letters from an Aunt Lila to young Robert while he's at school. It says, well, I guess he wasn't at school yet, but saying, we miss you and your mother very much and hope you will be able to return home once more. So there's really an identification with the South. And she finishes her letter, there is a great deal of uncertainty in the affairs now. A letter from Grandmama Mary B. Habersham wrote to him in May of 1865. The war is pretty much winding down by then, but she's perhaps not in their mind. She says, console your mother during this long separation. And shown on the slide here is one of Bob's prized possessions. It's a Confederate flag that had flown over Fort Sumter. It was later donated to the Confederate Museum in Charleston. Chapter 6. In this chapter, it seems that the Feitigs wanted to tell the rich and famous side of the story of the Coleman family. Auntie Ann Alden had a home in New York City, and Sue Ellen would soon follow suit by acquiring an apartment or a townhouse there adjacent to the St. Bartholomew's Church on Madison Avenue and 44th Street. Right, that's the upper left picture. On the upper right, the cottage in Cornwall was built in 1850s, as I said, and it was under renovation and expansion about every 10 years. You'll see a little bit more on that. Lower left is the Ashburton House in Washington, D.C., built around 1830 for British diplomats, and it was acquired by Sarah Hand Coleman in 1853 and became part of the family property with her sister, Margaret Coleman Freeman. Sue Ellen and her children visited frequently the cousins there. That would be the Freeman cousins, Willie and Eddie, during their travels north and south. Interesting fact, the museum was damaged by fire in 2020 during the what we would consider the George Floyd protest riots. Oh, but if I didn't say, that's right across the Lafayette Square from the White House. So quite prominent real estate there. Of course, hopefully you recognize the lower right picture, the Buckingham Mansion, as we call it now, which still serves us here at Cornwall Manor. Finally, with all of that groundwork laid, the focus of the story turns to our hero, Robert Haversham Coleman, aka Bob. Much of the history is told firsthand by letters written by his mother and sister while he was away. And he started at Hampden Rectory School in 1870, about age 14, with Reverend Charles William Everest, and he finished in 1873 and went on to Trinity College, both in Connecticut. And here I think it bears mentioning that Feitig left hints or cookie crumbs about Bob's journey of faith, starting with his Haversham family's strong Christian roots, and with his mother and sister, he attended Christ Episcopal Church, which had started in 1733 with the colony of Georgia. Its first ministers included John Wesley and Whitfield, as I said. Just for curiosity, later members of this church included Juliet Gordon Lowe, ring a bell? Yes. Founder of the Girl Scouts, and also a little more recent than that, popular musician Johnny Mercer. For what it's worth, Moon River and a bunch of Frank Sinatra songs like The Summer Wind. Now, that's the South. The Colemans of Cornwall were also among the faithful from St. James Episcopal in Lancaster and St. Luke's in Lebanon, right here, Cornwall United Methodist Church. And again, the other side of the Coleman family here, you've got a special event over at the Memorial Chapel coming up within a couple of weeks, I believe. And they built churches in the north side of Lebanon. Well, as Bob headed off to school and adulthood, his relatives, foremost his mother and guardians, Reverend Abel and Sam Small, tried to ground him, knowing the importance of living faithfully and being a good steward of the great wealth he was going to inherit. And this preparation here is important to note for later developments in the story. Well, we need a little comic relief here. Any Gilbert and Sullivan fans in the audience? Let me explain. And it's funny here how serious historians can make mistakes. They're human, and let me get into this a little bit. In some of the correspondence from college, we learned that Bob's male college friends enjoyed musical entertainment. By the way, Gilbert and Sullivan were the thing starting in 1871 up to about 1896. And so like many young people, they would attend the shows. And if you can identify that with your own, your upbringing. Reciting popular lyrics from memory was something you just did, right? Can anybody sing Moon River off the top of your head, right? You know that? Or I'm going out on a limb here. Does anybody know the lyrics from Monty Python's The Lumberjack song? Yes? He's a lumberjack and he's okay. You got it, see? There's a little Coleman in all of us. So unfortunately, when Feitig wrote this outline, he got a little, just had a mental moment there. He called it the Little Maiden of Amscodel, which is, when I tried looking that up, got nowhere, but I understood eventually he meant the tune Little Maid of Arcady that's in the Gilbert and Sullivan's first show Thespis in 1871. Now, Robert was in the Glee Club. And by the way, I have memories of a former work partner who was in the Glee Club at West Point. And whether I wanted him to do that or not, you know, all during the workday, he's singing Gilbert and Sullivan tunes to me. So it's just struck a thing in my background. So, but let me make sure you notice those lyrics, and I'll read them to you if you can't. These are very prescient, I think. Little maid of Arcady sat on cousin Robin's knee, fought in form and face and limb. Nobody could equal him. He was rich and she was fair. In truth, they made a pretty pair. Happy little maiden she, happy maid of RKD. Okay. So you can almost hear his friends singing these tunes to him. He had female friends as well, and there were many, and especially this girl named Lily, Jane Lily Clark. Her parents were deceased. She lived with the Barber family in Hartford, Connecticut, near Trinity College. And I pointed out the lyrics to you, and I do have the sheet music if you need that, if anybody feels compelled to sing. But the point is that Robert was, that did not work. Come on, stop. Just scrolling here. The point is that Robert was sweet on Lily, and so were his friends. There was a fellow named Ned Stedman, a name that goes back to the early history of Stiegel's furnace at the Elizabeth furnace. And Stedman writes to Bob that during their senior year, quote, "Yesterday afternoon when driving, I saw nearly all the young ladies in town, fine weather, and they were all out airing their shapes." That's how they talked back then, okay? Just telling you the news. He's talking, Jane, Honey, and Hunter were at the barber's window a good long time. Shoot him. Hunter is, I guess, the competition, right? So, but then he finishes the letter, give my regards, etc. So Stedman would refer to Lily as Honey, and he was quite happy when Robert and Lily were engaged in 1878. Unfortunately, I already clicked that, I guess. Robert's family was not so sweet on Lily, and he suffered some comments that must have hurt him deeply. Now, it might have changed, but there was at least one or two incidents that prompted this. A friend tried to console Bob in a letter, quote, "She may not be as fashionable and refined as some," but then she goes on to offer words of, to the effect that she was a wonderful young woman and a good match for Robert. So, and they married. We'll get more of that, but Feitigs wanted to go here first to chapter 9 and talk about the sister stables of Cornwall. In this chapter, Feitig turns from the interpersonal relationships and visits one of the ways that Robert enjoyed his wealth. In the 1870s, late 1870s, he had turned 21 and could now control the wealth that had been held in trust. He and his mother began a new round of improvements to the cottage, creating an extension and building a music conservatory and creating great landscapes. He also built the magnificent stable shown here on the left. And at the same time, the cousins, the Freeman family, were building their version right up here on the hill. There's an architect, W. Bledden Powell, who designed both structures, and you can see how similar they look. The collection even includes some of the architectural drawings and a specification that describes the quality of materials that was going into these buildings. And they both still stand, although the one on the left is in horrible condition. Chapter 10, House of Dream tumbles. So the next chapter in Coleman lore regards Robert's first marriage to Lily in 1879, at which time he began building a mansion for Lily. Robert receives much advice from his mother and his advisor, Artemis Wilhelm, about an appropriate location on the property down in the center here. And there's correspondence, Wilhelm supervising affairs while Robert is off honeymooning. And there's much to do here, supervising Powell, the architect, and acquiring materials, discussing costs that are in excess of $100,000. Also in 1880, Robert arranged for building a water supply for this coming down from the cold springs, which are about halfway over towards Mount Gretna. Now, Lily had been chronically ill and dies in May of 1880, and the project comes to a halt, and at least some of the stones are moved to St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Lebanon, which had been under construction. Its cornerstone was laid in October of 1879 and finished a year later. Well, what fascinated John Feitig about this first mansion, or the mansion, the fact that there were two and there was a lot of confusion. You can read different accounts that people are referring to mansions and unclear perhaps which one they're talking about, but clearly there was a mansion started building in the 1880 time frame. And Feitig was fascinated with the location of this as the second mansion. The photos of that are much more prominent and credible. And what happened is this photograph popped up as an explanation of the first mansion. And John enjoyed making presentations on this topic. Some of you may remember that. He left behind some photographs and notes that explain his theory that the mansion was being built west of Snitz Creek at a slightly higher elevation, at a place which presently stands a modern house owned by the Reppert family, not far from the Coleman stables. And one of the curious misunderstandings surrounding this bridal mansion was the circulation of the photograph you're looking at. An elegant mansion which fooled both local historians and descendants of the Coleman family for some time. Feitig wrote on, in his notes, reported to be Robert H. Coleman's first mansion. Obviously it is not. Jack Bittner got the photo from Elaine Ainsworth. You've heard those names mentioned at the beginning. And well, we were looking at the photo. It seems to pose several problems. First of all, it's a completed structure, and we know that the building never finished and got torn down. The architecture seems out of place. The grounds are pristine. If you can quite see it, there's two fancy folks just kind of lounging in the front yard there. And it really doesn't look like the local terrain. I had the opportunity to solve this riddle and publish a story about it last fall with Craig's help. Turns out that the photograph comes from the Dawson side of the Coleman family over at Elizabeth Furnace. And the original photo does have the misleading inscription on the back of it, Robert H. Coleman House, Cornwall, Pennsylvania. And it turned out that what this really is, the Dawson family traces its roots to the Arborfield estate near Reading in Berkshire, England, an estate that goes back to the 13th century and Henry VIII. So we had a local aha moment and solved one riddle anyway. So, but the photograph in the family files apparently misled the family for some generations. Let's keep moving. Well, ominous, ironic, indeed, to name this chapter 11, given what unfolded in the decade following Lily's death. A local newspaper account depicts him as taking solace in his model train shop the year after she died, but he was actually quite busy getting engaged in business in Florida with the railroads. Why? You know, well, perhaps in his mind, Cornwall was too well established, plenty of Colemans around here to run the family business. Then there was a gold rush of sorts going on down in Florida. Land development was slowly starting up. It then exploded in 1881, the same year we're talking about. And Robert apparently caught the fever. He linked up with Henry Flagler and Henry Plant, both of whom were developing Florida hotels and railroads. There was money to be made on freight and passengers, but additionally were the land grants of about 13,000 acres for every mile of track laid. So move over Walt Disney, right? They were really going to it back in that day. And a picture of a locomotive here might have been more appropriate given all that he was working on, but consistent with Feitig's preoccupation with the elegant stables and mansions, what you're looking at is Coleman's intended estate in St. Augustine, rivaling the palaces of Flagler and Plant. But he had not abandoned Cornwall, and I wrote this in the Florida Man story. It's wonderful how he divided his attention between north and south, because he was also buying land here in West Lebanon to build the new Colebrook furnaces along what is now Chestnut and Cumberland Streets. And he was also building his own Cornwall and Lebanon Railroad and engaged with Pennsylvania Railroad to build the westward extension from here out to Conewago, leading to the establishment of what becomes Mount Gretna. And oh yeah, he was also running a savings bank here in town. So it was considered a grand decade. He was credited with multiplying his wealth, possibly simply by over leveraging his assets, as some critics observe. There was a grand dinner at the Eagle Hotel that celebrated him for his successes and benevolence to the people of Lebanon. Okay, keep moving. More mansions, chapter 12. A little bit of a story here that both Robert and his sister Anne had their own mansions. Anne married Archibald Rogers in May 1880, the day after Lily's death, and they made their home up in Hyde Park, New York, and over a few years built their Cromwell Hall estate overlooking the Hudson River. Anne's wealth matched Robert's and far exceeded Archie's. In fact, a prenuptial agreement had Robert managing her assets and forbidding Archie from accessing them. Yeah. Anne and Archie raised a wonderful family. Their children grew up with young Franklin Delano Roosevelt next door, and included some details about that in the Anne of Cornwall story. Meanwhile, in 1883, Robert married his second wife, Edith Johnstone, who had been a ward of the family and almost a sister to Robert over the years. And they lived for a while in a spacious cottage extension with Mother Sue Ellen. But you can imagine, as they're growing a family of 5 children and have significant wealth, the majestic Cornwall Hall was designed in 1888 and began construction in 1889. And so that's what you see in the lower left. Construction halted in 1899 due to financial difficulties, finally torn down in 1914. So one more reason we have wonderful photographs, but you go down in Cornwall Center and you see an empty field. Seems tragic. A newspaper account called it the grandest mansion in Pennsylvania. And just as a point of research, get there, come on. The architect for that mansion, Hewitt and Hewitt, had also previously designed in 1881 the Maybrook estate over in Wynwood, northwest of Philadelphia. And if you studied those, I think you'd see some similarities in the architecture. And that still stands. That's some kind of a residence. I don't think quite like Cornwall Manor, but apartments and all of that kind of thing. Well, chapter 13, some in the online audience here may not know about our local treasure called Mount Gretna in the South Hills of Lebanon County. I mean, we got people listening from Alaska, for crying out loud, right? So in the early 1880s, our hero ran a 16-mile extension of his railroad down to Conewago to connect with the Pennsylvania Railroad. There in the woods was born the idea of a recreational campground for church, tent meetings, picnics and cottages, ice cream and roller skating. Coleman invited the Pennsylvania Guard to encamp there, which they did for a number of years, encouraged by the facilities that he constructed for them. This was not purely altruistic. He had contracts that ensured that they would use his railroad to transport troops and supplies. This was the basis of the National Guard riot story in the LebTown publication. Late in the 1880s, Coleman built Gretna's narrow gauge railroad, transporting people up Governor Dick Mountain and around the grounds. And in 1889, he hosted Trinity alumni for a week with programs by the Trinity Glee Club and Lebanon's Perseverance Band, which we get around here to entertain us from time to time. Camp included visits from Governor Beaver, and Archibald Rogers came and offered $50 prizes for sporting events, which included apparently 2 boat races and a tug race. Also, expansive fireworks were arranged for the final night. Chapter 14, life was flourishing both north and south. Coleman was president of his own concerns here in Lebanon and president also of the Jacksonville, Tampa, and Key West Railway, and a director of the Florida Construction Company. With Plant and Flagler's involvement, there were significant achievements in extending the railroads, but also they were experiencing at the time economic pressures, regulation by the Florida Railroad Commission. And in 1888, there was a yellow fever plague to contend with down there. But the Florida newspapers wrote favorable stories about the young, energetic businessman. Even so, the wheels were quite literally coming off his empire. The Florida Construction Company was a separate business that profited by selling railroad equipment to the railroads. Coleman and his fellow directors had both left and right hands stirring the pot, and there were accusations of sloppy financial record keeping. In Feitig's materials, there were several letters that showed him as early as 1883 finding himself pressured to overextend, which leads to his later demise. He was overextending not just his financial resources, but further reaching beyond his own business abilities. He made commitments in haste that he did not want to keep. The New York City directors had been counting on him to contribute his share to the investments in Florida. His heart and his old cautious mentors in Lebanon were telling him to reverse on those commitments. But the power players held his feet to the fire, saying basically, pay up or get some of your wealthy Philadelphia friends to cover for you. So his pride pressed him forward to continue through the decade, and he learned how to leverage his assets to invest in other projects. And I suppose that can work as long as the bubble keeps expanding, which it was at the time. Almost done here. So, of course, the bubble did pop in 1893. The entire country fell to a global panic, and it was one of the worst financial crises in our country's history. Railroads failed, leading to 15,000 businesses closing, causing catastrophic unemployment. Coleman's Florida assets were among the casualties. His assets went into receivership in August of 1893, managed by his brother-in-law, Archie Rogers, and his cousin, William C. Freeman. They liquidated his assets to cover debts. Freeman took over many of Robert's properties, which is why we typically hear the name Freeman in Cornwall and not Coleman. Part of the story, even we're sitting at Freeman Auditorium, for example. There were also a number of court cases, and Robert had resigned his positions, actually starting in 1892. Things that started unraveling at that point. And that wasn't all the trouble. Furthermore, his mother died April of 1892, and in late July, Robert was taking his family to Europe so that wife Edith could convalesce from her worsening tuberculosis. So was he simply escaping financial embarrassment, or one might wonder if grief on the loss of his mother and a sense of guilt, her voice always warning him against a life of extravagance, had finally flipped a switch in his life's philosophy. I did find a ship manifest showing his return to the States, June 26, 1893, on the Lebanon with his wife and 5 children. The children were only 7 years and younger at that point. And as already mentioned, before the end of the summer, his estate was in receivership. Early in 1894, they loaded a carriage and headed for Saranac Lake. And it's curious, just mentioning newspaper.com, there's still a number of things going on with him and his businesses in 1894. So it's not just this idyllic running off into the sunset. So there might need to be another chapter in Feitig's book about those last days here. But you can see there in the notes, a lot going on, weighing on his shoulders in 1893. They do arrive in Saranac Lake, build a very nice cure cottage for Edith. And there are reports that Robert also suffered from tuberculosis, although he would live another 37, half of his life, another 37 years, finally dying of stomach cancer in 1930. His photograph album suggests it was an idyllic period in his life. His children would grow up there. The son's going off to college and the military. Edith would live almost another 10 years, and the records show that Robert was actively enjoying the region. He cataloged the birds of the Adirondacks. He tried running a cigar store, enjoyed baseball memories with his neighbor, Christy Mathewson. I did find a census broker where he reports his occupation in Saranac Lake as loan broker. This may have been a touch of dark humor, but there were reports of visits to Saranac Lake by Lebanon businessmen. So perhaps there's an untold story of how he continued to use his wealth after 1893. Chapter 17, last two here, some mysteries that linger. As the Feitigs reach the end of their story, there still seem to be some unanswered questions in the Feitigs' minds. This was alluded to in the Sunday edition of the Lebanon paper under the title, Mysteries That Linger. The first mystery clearly was the fascination with the first bridal mansion that we covered already, and whether it existed at all. The Feitigs were passionately arguing for its existence, and therefore the focus was on discovering and proving its location. In the files, they left a mountain of photographs they took on several walking trips across the Coleman property there in Cornwall Center. As far as the second mystery, some conjecture, Feitig was not satisfied that Robert H. Coleman left Lebanon due to financial ruin. He had plenty of assets and sizable income that could have sustained him, so why did he leave? And I've mentioned perhaps it was the tuberculosis, perhaps also the shame at disappointing his mother and the citizens of Lebanon who had their savings in his bank, the voice of his dead mother and other mentors who had warned him, and perhaps he wanted his children to grow up unencumbered by the stigma of that. Well, this final chapter is a puzzle. John Feitig's outline offered no subheadings or clues. So what memories had he intended? One possibility is the ongoing stream of tragedies that pursued Coleman even during his years in sanctuary at Saranac Lake. His first wife had died, his mother had died, then Edith, his second wife, dies while he is still 40-something years old. His son, Ralph, dies by suicide. Then in late 1918, Bob gets a report that his oldest son, Robert, had died on October 9th of pneumonia while serving in the military in France. In anguish, he relayed the news to Judge Henry here in Lebanon, and the news was reported in the paper on November 6th. But a week later, Robert learns the happy news that his son was alive after all. He then sends a telegram to the judge to ignore the previous report. And just try to imagine his relief. One crisis averted. Another lingering memory is the fate of the majestic Cornwall Hall that remained unfinished in the ornate stables that now lie crumbling in a Cornwall field. His many mansions are gone. And will the stables be restored? The borough has hopes they're trying to figure out how to make that a reality, and it would be a great thing, I think. So, did Coleman find redemption of sorts in Saranac Lake? He spent decades there. His photo album shows joyful moments with his children, even some of them enjoying tennis matches and boating, just as he had enjoyed croquet and baseball games here in Cornwall with his sister and cousins many years earlier. Jeannie Bolts mentioned to me having sat with John after his wife had died, John's wife, Margery, and he talked with passion about his desire to get this story right. But it's a story they never published. And a question there at the bottom, why not? What were they waiting for to accomplish that? Maybe it was Margery's own failing health and passing in 2016 that John seemed to have lost interest in finishing. And in a sense, walking in the same footsteps of the man who tore down one dream mansion after another and walked away. So, in conclusion, I wanted to offer 3 hopes. First, I hope I've succeeded in leaving you both intrigued and yet wanting more of the story. Time only allowed so much this evening. And I find every time I touch this material, I end up with more questions and more reasons to keep digging. Secondly, I hope that you've been more than amused by the story, but provoked in some way. And the question I want to ask you is, why do we gather on Tuesday evenings to tell these stories? Is it simply the ritual of reciting history like we do, reciting lyrics to Gilbert and Sullivan tunes, or singing Moon River, or He's a Lumberjack, if that appeals to you? Nope, let's not get away from things. Challenge is operating this thing, sorry. So why are we intrigued by this story? In our local Cornwall borough, most residents drive through every day unaware of our significant history. The iron mine, the furnaces, the Coleman story, and most traces removed of that. The mine's filled with water. Fortunately, we have a furnace. And I thought, what if God had not blessed us with the rich wealth of this mine? What would we, and so therefore, since he did bless us with this, what should we do about this? And I had a third hope, and that is that something that's occurred to me in all of my digging for these last couple of years, that you grasp history foremost as an art. I think mostly we treat it as a science because we dig, we want details, we want facts, and we gather information and test a hypothesis. Is this the way it was? Was that the right mansion? And it seems to me we spend all of our time together on the science. But interpretation means assigning meaning to those facts. And it's the moment that you look and you say, ah, I see something. That is art, not science. And more to the point, art leaves you feeling something. Acting on that feeling, that understanding, I think that's what life is all about. And I thank you very much. We almost got it. Mike's coming up, and I think we'll be talking about questions.
We had a larger group tonight. Usually it only takes me about half that time to walk up to the front. So that's a great sign. So, of course, Bruce gave a really great presentation. I remember when we were approached to take this collection, I figured we'd get a box and several boxes came and lots of photographs. And that was about the time that Bruce came on to be a volunteer. And he said, well, do you have a need for anything? I said, well, I got this collection, you know, but we don't know what's in it. So what Bruce's kind of first job with this was just to go ahead and make a finding aid so that we could be able to see what was in it. But the thing is that in order to make a finding aid, you have to read it all. So that's kind of where Bruce got in with this, where he was reading it. And I know Jim was working on his book at the time, so that there were, you know, interest in what would be in this collection that could go ahead and answer all these different questions that we've had. So I know Bruce gave a lot of information. You know, sometimes it's hard to put 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag, but I think he did a great job at that. So open up to the floor. Are there any questions for Bruce about his presentation? So I'll step aside.
You saying when Robert H. Coleman passed, what kept the mines going? Well, I mean, there is the rest of the Coleman family. Robert had left, and there's this. I'm not going to be the one to tell that as well as some could, like Jim. But yeah, it was the R.W. Coleman heirs, and they went through some transitions to different companies, but that continued. Sold to Lackawanna at some point, and you know, so there was well managed. But then Bethlehem Steel came in.
Yeah, well, Lackawanna was leasing the properties. They ended up, you know, being bought by Bethlehem Steel. Pennsylvania Steel had bought the North Lebanon property, and you know, ownership in New York. There's a lot of very involved financial transactions that spanned over a decade, actually more like 2 decades, but eventually Bethlehem Steel said, okay, we're going to buy everything from everybody, or we're not buying anything at all. So everybody ponied up and they all made millions. So everybody was happy, and then Bethlehem Steel just kept it rolling for, you know, all of what you remember.
You could have made a TV show about Dynasty. You know, it's the wealth in that mine that precipitated so much activity here. And Bethlehem still didn't want the furnaces really, but the furnaces, the rights to the mine were attached to the furnaces. So that's
They did want the operations that were downtown Lebanon.
true. True. Yeah.
The rocks that did it all.
Okay. I'm here for Robert H. Coleman questions mostly. Or how did you feel? Did you feel something? Go ahead.
The Coleman stables down in the center of town.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the borough trying to figure out what to do with them or how to acquire them. Yeah. Can you say anything more about
He's
that?
asking about the borough hoping to acquire and restore the stables. I'm part of a committee. They formed 2 committees, a recreation committee and a historical committee, with the idea of doing a number of things here to create a greater sense of identity in Cornwall. I don't think I'm the one to say what they're doing, but you know, things are still kind of being churned around, but they involve things like expanding the rail trail. There's all these railroad spurs around Cornwall that would make interesting walking paths, and there's signage that furnace people are involved with creating, and there would be more things like that, both from a recreational and from a historical. And they view the stables, you know, let's capture that before it's too late, you know, so.
Where are the stables located?
Where are the stables located? Let's orient this. You know where the school is? Down at the Dangerous Corners, down at the middle of Cornwall. So to the northwest of that, if you were proceeding north of Cornwall Road, off to your left, you see a line of trees. Especially during the winter, you look over there, you'll see a steeple shape. That's the top of the.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a, you know, there's those open sports fields and then a line of trees about where Snitz Creek goes down through there. That may be it.
Right.
Last call. Well, thank you for sitting patiently. Was there something, Vince? Yeah, the old bird and bird. Do you spell bird with an I or a U? And occasionally a Y, whoever said that, yeah.
Thomas's name was Bird, B-I-R-D.
B-I-R-D.
Somewhere along the way, you know, there were famous birds in the area, but not in the family, and
Yeah.
somewhere along the way that transferred to Marcus. The original first was named B-I-R-D.
R-D. There was a B-U-R-D associated with the grubs in a different place, and Robert, well, no, let's not money it, but yes, there's a lot. And you often get people yelling, you spelled it wrong. No, well, yeah, he was Thomas Bird, like the thing with feathers. So, yeah, very good.
I'm just curious with the southern connection
Yeah,
and owning cotton, and did you in your findings see anything about like slavery stuff?
Yeah.
Concerns? Like how did that, with the cousins up north, can you dig into that?
yeah, she's asking about the South, the Southern business with the Habershams and connection to slavery. Very definitely, they owned slaves on the plantation, rice and cotton plantations at the time.
But what was the, I guess I'm thinking of the cousins up north, what were their ideas of these cousins down south?
I guess what were the northern attitudes about that? The best I could see, it was just understanding or acceptance, and you know, there was this conflict mounting in the country over those decades, right?
Slavery was legal here until the 1830s.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, slavery was part of the story.
What do you know about the burial of black slaves on this property?
Well, that's been discussed. The question was, what do we know about burial of slaves here on this property? And there were some interns here that have done research 2 summers in a row. Do you want to illuminate that?
Sure. There had been a story that there was burial ground on the property for enslaved people. And it was one of those things that I know when I first saw that, that's kind of an oft used story. You know, when you look at early 20th century history, late 19th century history, it's all, you know, everyone says this was a burial ground for Native Americans, or this was a burial ground for slaves. If they couldn't understand something, oftentimes it showed up or there were stories about it. So when I first saw that here, I thought, well, maybe this is kind of one of those stories. However, we had interns that were going through primary sources. And one of the first ledger books that we looked at for Cornwall Iron Furnace, the earliest one starts late 1752. And within the first couple dozen pages of that, one of the expenses came out, coffin for old Ned. And we had seen old Ned as one of the enslaved people that was working in Cornwall. So automatically, like, someone died who was enslaved, there was a coffin made for them, they had to put them in the ground somewhere. So now that started to be, you know, there was a lot more credence to that story. And then also as part of Bruce's efforts of going through documents, there was a transcribed oral history done by a man named Thomas McLean.
Thank you.
And McLean, I think, was born in the 1790s period, and he was recounting stories that he had heard from his father, and also ones that he had witnessed here as well. And he talked about some of the enslaved people that worked with not only at the furnace, but on this property, because he also had worked as a gardener on this property in the early 19th century. But he also then talked about this cemetery for the enslaved. And he talked about it on this property. So that was another kind of piece in the puzzle. And then kind of a final piece of the puzzle is that in work that Mike Weber was doing, which was transcribing a number of notes and things that had been collected at the furnace over the years, and he put them in one singular timeline. And there was an expense where Thomas McLean, when he had died, had been buried on this property, and there was an expense to move his grave to the Methodist Church. And if you go over today, there's a stone at the Methodist Church. So that now we've had, someone who was enslaved, who died, we know that. We have someone, in his oral history is saying that there was a cemetery on this property, but then we also had a white gardener who died, who was on a cemetery in this property that had been moved. So I think all of those certainly do point in the direction that there certainly was that here on this property.
Where are the cemeteries?
It was pointed out, there had been a family that worked, primarily people that took care of the horses and also took care of the carriages. The last name was Mellon. And this is a black family, and that family was living here, I think, as early as the 1850s. They show up in the census, move into Lancaster later in the 19th century and become a fairly prominent family there. And he points out a location to people. And if you look at the book by Sue Wenzel and Mike Trump that they did on this property, there's a picture of kind of a glade of trees that shows that this historically has been the spot that, through this oral history handed down from people like McLean and the Mellons and other, that this was the spot that has been, which is, let me think, in my orientation, would be this direction of this building. I've never been able to go walk to the exact spot myself because all the building construction that's happened here kind of blocks out for where the photo is, but I think it's possible to be found.
Yeah, Dave?
Bruce, do you have other source material besides the things that you got from fighting? Do you go to other source material other than the vapors?
Other than Feitig's material, what were my sources?
You have other sources.
Well, he dropped a clue, so I mean, using modern things, I mean, I confess to looking at Wikipedia, but then you end up at university sites and state libraries. I mean, there's just a lot out there, and it takes some patience to dig through it. That's what I had used. Is that helping you, or
Well, they gave you a treasure trove.
a little louder?
They gave you a treasure trove of information. to
Yes.
start with. I didn't know whether you had other sources that they'd given you.
Well, I mean, we've got a collection called the Ainsworth Collection. Lane Ainsworth was one of the historians, and there's a couple of large buckets of material she collected, as an example. There's a few others, a lot of Bethlehem steel records. Those weren't necessarily relevant to what I was talking about tonight. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of great resource of material, as well as people, knowledgeable people there across the street that we're so blessed to have here. Yeah.
I'm interested in walking around.
He's asking, he would like to be able to walk the historic grounds around here. How do we do that? Well, occasionally there's tours offered. Mike Trump did a tour of Miners Village, right? And he plans to do some of the other villages in the borough. Maybe there's an opportunity to ask for something specific, and we'll get something going. Is Kathy going to offer one?
No. Both of the communities of Cornwall books were meant to be for walking tours. So both of those have information about historic locations throughout the community.
Okay, she's saying they're Mike and Susan published these books, Communities Across Time, very pictorial, but meant to be walking tours. And they're also over at the furnace, some small maps for walking tours that point all the, go up and down the different streets, and that's what these various houses were back in the day. So those are good research, and I think they cover the county now, don't they?
Yes.
There's about 8 different maps. So
Henry Beamer, a resident here, has taken tours around Cornwall
yes,
and pointed out.
we have our own historian on campus who does the tours of Cornwall Manor proper. So yeah, lots of opportunities.
I think we'll make this then the last question.
Yeah, last question,
I'm
Vince.
just wondering about the cemetery, if there's an idea of where it is, are there next steps, archaeologists or?
Not to my knowledge.
He was asking if there's plans for archaeologists to do more digs. There was a little bit, I think, back when they were. But thank you.
So just a couple of things before we go ahead and wrap up. A reminder, as Bruce had mentioned, there's a couple of his articles that have been expanded into book form that were published. Those are for sale at the back of the room if you're interested in that. Also, we do run these run these sessions that we go ahead and are able to put on Zoom. If you're able or willing to make a small donation, there's a basket back on that table as well. So if you wouldn't mind dropping a few dollars in, we certainly would appreciate it. That helps to go ahead and support our programming. So thank you all for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank Bruce for his presentation and for Kathy Donaldson for helping to organize our virtual talk. Also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored the program, and of course Cornwall Manor for allowing us to use this wonderful space. So please join us for our next lecture on Tuesday, September 10th, when Sue Wenzel and Mike Trump will give their lecture, The Mansions of Cornwall, Icons of an Industrial Dynasty. So this is going to be specifically on mansions that are gone and those that are still standing here in Cornwall. And also our next event will be on October 26th and 27th, when the museum will have a Civil War living history event. So if you wish to air your figure and come out and see us in person, please do so. Just a reminder that the museum is open Friday through Sunday for tours, and please check our website for details and tour information. And everyone, please stay safe and have a good night.